1:42 p.m. A military hospital, ER, in San Diego. The air is sterile, heavy with the hum of monitors and the distant sound of Pacific waves. A group of Navy SEALs, fresh from a grueling field exercise, sit in the waiting area. Dusty, tired, and full of bravado. In the center of the room, a new nurse is quietly prepping a suture kit. No one looks twice at her. Suddenly, a man bursts through the double doors. He's frantic, screaming, shoving equipment over. The medical staff freezes. The SEALs tense up, ready to strike. But before they can move, the nurse steps forward. "Clear the space, now!" The ER at Naval Medical Center San Diego is rarely a quiet place. But today felt different. The sun was beating down on the asphalt outside, creating a shimmering haze that mirrored the restless energy inside. The incoming patients were mostly elite warriors with minor training abrasions, salt burns, or the kind of bone-deep heat fatigue that only San Diego training cycles can produce. Nurse Alex Morgan, 27, moved with a rhythmic efficiency that most people took for granted. She was 5'7", with her hair pulled back into a tight regulation bun that showed no signs of flyaway strands despite her long shift. In her personnel file, she was listed simply as a registered nurse with a background in trauma care and a few years of unspecified military service. To the world, she was just another face in a blue scrub suit, a cog in the massive medical machine of the U.S. Navy. Sitting on the plastic chairs near the triage station were 4 Navy SEALs. They were loud, their presence filling the small room with the scent of dried sweat, salt spray, and the metallic tang of tactical gear. They were frogmen, the tip of the spear, and they viewed the hospital as a safe zone, a place where the intensity of the world was turned down to a dull murmur. They were off the clock, their situational awareness softened by the familiar safety of the base. They joked among themselves, their laughter echoing off the tile walls, occasionally glancing at the support staff with the benign indifference of predators in a petting zoo. "Look at this place," one of the operators, a petty officer named Miller, said with a smirk as he leaned back. "It's nice to be in a room where the air conditioning actually works, and no one is trying to blow you up with a pressure plate IED. Must be nice for these nurses, huh? Low pressure, easy hours, just filling out forms and handing out ibuprofen." He wiped a smear of mud from his forearm, looking satisfied with his own observation. His teammate, a mountain of a man named Jax, looked over at Alex. She was currently checking the calibration on a heart monitor, her movements precise and economy-driven. "She looks a bit young to be handling this ward," Jax whispered, loud enough for Alex to hear over the hum of the electronics. "I bet she hasn't seen anything more stressful than a paper cut or a late lunch delivery. She probably joined the Navy for the tuition assistance and the quiet life. You see the way she handles those syringes, like she's afraid of a little blood." Alex didn't turn around. She didn't flinch. She didn't even acknowledge the casual disrespect that often came with being a woman in a support role within a hyper-masculine environment. In her mind, she was already conducting a 360-degree scan of the room, a habit that had been burned into her synapses years ago. She noted the heavy oxygen tanks secured against the wall, the sharp corners of the metal medication carts, the weight of the heavy glass doors, and the 3 exits, including the restricted service door behind her. Her Marine Corps training was like a background program running on a supercomputer. It never truly shut off. She wasn't just a nurse, she was a professional observer. She was calculating the distance between the SEALs and the nearest civilian patient, an elderly veteran in a wheelchair who was struggling to breathe. As she prepared a suture kit, she listened to the symphony of the hospital, the squeal of rubber soles on linoleum, the chime of an elevator, the distant bark of a doctor, and then a sound that didn't fit the rhythm. It was a rhythmic thud coming from the main corridor, a sound of heavy footsteps, disorganized, fast, and heavy on the heels. To the untrained ear, it was just someone running. To Alex, it was the sound of a charge. The SEALs were still laughing, talking about their next weekend dive and the beer they were going to drink at the O Club. They were relaxed, their guard down. They saw a quiet girl in scrubs. They didn't see the woman who had spent 18 months in a hide site in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, watching targets through a long-range optic for 72 hours at a time without blinking, adjusting for windage and elevation in her sleep. To them, Alex was a non-combatant, someone to be protected if the sirens went off, not someone to lead. But in the world of the quiet professional, the greatest weapon isn't the one you see on your hip or the rifle slung across your back. It's the one sitting behind your eyes, processing data at the speed of light. Alex reached out and slowly placed a hand on the edge of the metal cart, grounding herself. She knew something was coming. She could feel the shift in the air pressure, the way the vibration in the floor changed. The SEALs were still focused on their stories, but Alex's focus was already locked on the double doors at the end of the hall. If you think quiet professionals are often underestimated, type, "That's unfair." The piece shattered in an instant. The double doors at the end of the hallway didn't just open. They were kicked wide with a violent bang that made the ceiling tiles rattle. A man in his late 30s, disheveled, sweat-soaked, and wild-eyed, charged into the ER. He wasn't carrying a weapon that anyone could see, but his presence was a weapon in itself. He was screaming, unintelligible, raw sounds of a mind that had lost its tether to reality. It was the sound of a total psychotic break. He collided with a medication cart, sending glass vials and steel trays crashing to the floor with a sound like a series of gunshots. A young intern screamed and retreated into a corner, dropping her clipboard. The elderly veteran in the wheelchair tried to back away, but the wheels caught on the debris, leaving him trapped in the line of fire. The intruder was moving fast, his movements erratic, his hands clawing at the air as if trying to tear through an invisible veil. The SEALs reacted with the instant, programmed instinct of predators. They surged to their feet as one, their muscles tilling, their faces hardening into the masks of warriors. They were ready to neutralize the threat with overwhelming physical force. Miller began to move forward, his hands reaching to tackle the man and drive him into the floor. But the ER is a delicate ecosystem. A physical brawl in this space meant oxygen tanks could be knocked over, creating a potential explosion or crushing a bystander. Patients could be trampled, and the intruder, who appeared to be suffering from a severe PTSD-induced episode, could become a permanent casualty of a misinterpreted intervention. "Move back! We've got this!" Miller shouted at the nurses, preparing to lunge into a tackle. "Clear the space! Now!" The voice was low, resonant, and carried a specific frequency that stopped Miller in his tracks. It wasn't a scream for help. It wasn't the shrill panic of a civilian. It was a command. Alex Morgan had stepped out from behind her desk. She didn't run away. She didn't cower behind the SEALs. She moved into the center of the chaos, but she didn't close the distance. She stayed exactly 7 feet away from the intruder, a distance known in her old life as the reactionary gap. "Move the patients back," Alex said again, her eyes fixed on the man's hands, which were now balled into white-knuckled fists. Her voice was ice-cold, the kind of calm that only exists in the absolute eye of a Category 5 hurricane. The other nurses, snapping out of their shock by the sheer authority in Alex's tone, immediately began to wheel the elderly veteran toward the rear exit. The SEALs stood paralyzed for a heartbeat, visibly confused by the radiating power coming from the quiet girl they had just been mocking. Alex was performing a rapid threat assessment, the same way she used to scan a valley for muzzle flashes. She analyzed the man's pupils, dilated to the point of blackness, his breathing shallow, rapid, and forced. His posture, weight on his heels, not ready to strike with precision, but ready to flail with desperate, frantic energy. She didn't see a monster. She saw a target that needed to be contained through space and psychological pressure, not destroyed through impact. "Petty Officer Miller," Alex said without looking at him, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "Take the left flank. Do not touch him unless I say. Stay 3 feet back. Jax, watch the right. Guard the oxygen lines." Miller blinked, his ego momentarily short-circuiting. He was a SEAL, a Tier 1 operator, yet he was taking tactical orders from a nurse in San Diego. But something about her stance, the way her feet were planted with her weight perfectly balanced, her hands open and visible but ready to move in a blur, told him that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was controlling the terrain. The intruder roared, a sound of pure agony, and grabbed a heavy medical monitor from a nearby stand, lifting it above his head like a boulder. The SEALs prepared to tackle him, fearing for her safety, but Alex stepped directly into his line of sight. She didn't look at the monitor. She didn't look at the threat. She looked directly into his eyes, projecting an unshakable, calm dominance. "Put it down," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of inevitable fact. She wasn't using physical strength. She was using control of space. By staying at a specific, calculated angle, she forced the man to turn his body away from the patients to face her. She was drawing the fire, becoming the center of his universe. She was directing the flow of the room like a sniper directing a shot. She knew that if he threw that monitor, she had exactly 0.4 seconds to move, and she had already calculated the trajectory of the glass before he even finished lifting it. In that moment, the ER didn't feel like a hospital anymore. It felt like a high-stakes kill zone. And Alex Morgan was the only person in the room who truly understood the geography of the crisis. If you realize calm thinking can control chaos, type, "I was wrong." The intruder was breathing like a cornered animal, a low, guttural wheeze that filled the sudden silence. The heavy monitor was still shaking in his hands, the glass screen reflecting the flickering, fluorescent lights above. The air in the ER was thick with the silent tension of a bomb about to go off. Jax and the other SEALs were spread out, their hands hovering near their belts, watching the nurse with a mixture of confusion and a mounting, bone-deep respect. They had seen command presence in some of the most legendary officers in the Navy, but they had never seen it displayed with such surgical precision in a civilian hospital setting. Alex didn't blink. Her eyes were soft, a technique she had mastered at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper course at Camp Pendleton. It allowed her to maintain her peripheral vision, watching the man's feet for a shift in weight, his shoulders for a telltale twitch, and the SEAL's position simultaneously. She was a human radar. "You're okay," she said, her voice dropping into a soothing but firm cadence that acted like a sedative. "You're in a hospital, Marine. No one is going to hurt you here, but you need to put that down. Now. That's an order you can follow." The man looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a sign of fear, a flicker of hesitation, or the scent of adrenaline. He found none. He found only the steady, unyielding gaze of a woman who had stared down much worse than a confused intruder in a San Diego clinic. He saw a peer, slowly, agonizingly. His muscles began to relax. The monitor lowered an inch, then two. Finally, he set it down on the floor with a dull, heavy thud. He sank to his knees, covering his face with his hands, and began to sob with the sound of a man whose world had finally collapsed. "Security! 10 seconds out!" A voice crackled over the hospital intercom, breaking the spell. The crisis wasn't over, but the explosion had been averted. As the base security team flooded into the room with zip ties and soft restraints to safely secure the man for medical assistance, the SEALs finally let out the breath they had been holding for the last 3 minutes. They retreated to the corner of the room, watching as Alex immediately transitioned from tactical commander back into nurse mode. She didn't celebrate her victory. She didn't brag. She simply knelt beside the man, checking his vitals as he was being secured, speaking quietly and gently to him, her hands certain and clinical. Miller walked over to her as she was washing the chemical debris and sweat off her hands at the sink. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they had entered the building. He noticed the way she moved, the total economy of motion, the way she never turned her back on the door, even while drying her hands. "That wasn't nursing school training," Miller said, his voice quiet and stripped of its earlier arrogance. "The way you held that line, the way you assessed the room, you didn't panic, not even for a millisecond. You military before? And don't tell me you were just a clerk." Alex pulled a fresh pair of nitrile gloves from the dispenser. She didn't look up immediately. "Marine Corps," she replied simply. "Corpsman?" Jax asked, stepping closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over the sink. "No," Alex said, finally looking him in the eye. "Infantry. Sniper qualified. "First Marine Division. I was a hog." The silence that followed was heavier than the chaos from minutes before. The SEALs looked at each other, the realization hitting them like a physical blow. A hog, a hunter of gunmen, a Marine sniper. It was one of the most difficult and psychologically demanding qualifications in the entire Department of Defense, a role that required a level of mental discipline, patience, and lethal precision that few humans on the planet possessed. "I was a sergeant," Alex continued, her voice matter-of-fact as she began reorganizing her suture kit. "I did 2 combat tours in the Helmand province, one in the Sangin Valley. I decided after my second deployment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life putting people back together instead of, well, you know what my old job was. I traded the long gun for a stethoscope because I wanted to see the people I watched actually live for once." Jax rubbed the back of his neck, looking down at his boots with genuine shame. He remembered his joke from earlier about her being too young and looking for a quiet life. He realized he had been lecturing a veteran who had likely seen more sustained combat than half the men in his squadron combined. He had been patronizing a woman who had mastered the art of the cold bore shot under conditions he could only imagine. "Why nursing? Why here?" Jax asked, his voice full of a new kind of curiosity. "Because a sniper's greatest skill isn't the trigger pull," Alex said, looking him dead in the eye. "It's observation. It's watching a person's breathing from 1,000 yards, the twitch of their eye, the way they carry their weight when they think no one is looking. It's about knowing what someone is going to do before they even realize they're going to do it. That's what makes an elite nurse, Jax. I can tell a patient is going into septic shock or a pulmonary embolism 3 minutes before the monitor beeps because I've spent years watching bodies through a 10-power scope. I don't need a machine to tell me when someone is fading." She wasn't bragging. She was simply stating the code she lived by. To her, the mission had changed, but the training never left her. The skills that made her a lethal markswoman made her an elite healer. The ability to stay calm under the crushing pressure of a 1,000-yard shot in a crosswind was the same ability that allowed her to prevent a bloodbath in a San Diego ER. The SEALs stood there, the elite warriors of the Navy, feeling humbled in the presence of a hog. They realized that the quietest person in the room is often the one with the most power. Alex didn't need a rifle to control the room. She didn't need to tackle the man to save the ward. She used her mind. She used her discipline. She used the silence. As the security team took the intruder away for a full psychiatric evaluation, the ER began to return to its sterile, busy rhythm. But the atmosphere had shifted on a molecular level. The SEALs were no longer talking about the easy life of the medical staff. They were watching Alex work with a reverence that couldn't be bought with a title, a badge, or a row of medals. "If you believe training never leaves you, type, I am in debt." The rest of the shift was uneventful, at least by the chaotic standards of an emergency room. Alex went back to her charting, her hands flying across the keyboard with the same terrifying precision she used to adjust her windage and elevation on a long-range engagement. She didn't ask for a thank you from the administration. She didn't report the incident as a heroic act to her supervisor. To her, it was just a contained event, a problem identified and solved according to the protocol. The SEALs were finally called back for their physicals. When it was Miller's turn, he walked into the small exam room where Alex was waiting with a blood pressure cuff and a digital thermometer. The room was small, quiet, and smelled of high-grade rubbing alcohol. The bravado he had walked in with hours ago was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful demeanor. Miller sat on the exam table, his large frame making the furniture look like a toy. He was a man who had jumped out of planes into the dark of night, but he felt uncharacteristically nervous. "Nurse Morgan, Alex, look, about what I said in the waiting room, I was out of line. I was a jerk. I didn't know who I was talking to, and that's my fault. I assumed the scrubs meant you didn't know the weight of the world." Alex wrapped the cuff around his arm, her touch firm but professional. "It doesn't matter, petty officer. You saw a nurse. That's what I am now. That's the job I chose, and I'm proud of it. You didn't insult the Marine. You just underestimated the nurse. And in this building, the nurse is the one in charge." But the way you stepped in, Miller persisted, watching her face. You saved that guy's life. If Jax or I had tackled him in that state, with all that equipment around, someone would have ended up in the ICU or worse. You read him like a book. You controlled the whole room without raising your voice or breaking a sweat. It was the most impressive thing I've seen in years. Alex started the manual pump, watching the needle climb. The cuff tightened. She watched the mercury needle with a focus that reminded Miller of a spotter watching a tracer through the dust. In the Corps, we were taught that the loud actions are usually for when the plan has already failed. If you're calm, if you understand the terrain and the human heart, you don't need to be loud. You just need to be correct. Silence is a weapon, Miller. Use it. She finished the reading and noted it down on her tablet. 122/80? You're healthy, Miller, but get some sleep. Your adrenaline levels are still spiking from the adrenaline dump earlier. You're running hot. As he stood up to leave, he stopped at the heavy oak door. He turned and offered a slow, deliberate nod. Not a formal military salute, which would have been against protocol in a civilian medical setting, but a silent salute between two professionals who had both been in the X. It was an acknowledgement of shared burden and mutual respect. I'll see you around, Sergeant, and thank you for keeping the perimeter. It's just Alex now, she replied with a small, rare smile that finally reached her eyes. Outside in the hallway, the other 3 SEALs were waiting. They didn't joke or tease as they usually did. As they walked toward the glass exit doors, they passed Alex's station one by one. Each of them touched the brim of their cap or offered a respectful nod. They had come into the hospital thinking they were the only real warriors in the building. They left knowing that the most dangerous Marine they had ever met was currently checking the expiration date on a box of sterile bandages and prepping a room for a child with a fever. Alex watched them go through the glass doors into the bright California sun. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a legend. She felt like a professional who had completed a task and was ready for the next one. She turned back to her station, picked up her clipboard, and headed toward room 3. There was a young sailor there with a high fever, and he needed her help. The mission changes. The uniform changes. But the training never leaves you. It just finds a new way to save the world. If you believe respect should come from actions, type, I will live a decent life. In our modern world, we are taught to look for the loudest voices. We are taught that strength is about how much noise you make, how big your muscles are, or how many shiny medals you wear on your chest for the world to see. We judge people based on their job titles and their first impressions, often ignoring the extras in the background who are actually holding the foundation together. But the story of Alex Morgan is a powerful reminder of a deeper, more profound truth. True greatness is silent. It is found in the steady hands and the focused gaze of someone who has stared into the absolute chaos of existence and refused to blink. Real competence doesn't need a spotlight. It doesn't need to brag about its past on social media or demand respect from strangers. Real skill is a debt you pay to the people around you in the moments when they are at their most vulnerable. In the military, they have a saying, the most dangerous thing on the battlefield is a calm mind. Alex proved that this is true in the hospital too. She didn't use her elite sniper training to win a fight or to flex her power. She used it to prevent a fight from ever happening. She used her ability to read a situation, control a space, and understand the human mind to protect the very people who were underestimating her only minutes before. We tell these stories because the world is full of Alex Morgans, people who have walked through fire and now spend their days making sure the rest of the world stays cool. They are the teachers who were once officers, the mechanics who were once pilots, the nurses who were once snipers, and the neighbors who carry a history of courage that you might never see until the day you need it most. They are the quiet professionals who don't seek the glory, but always deliver the results. Respect isn't a gift you give to someone because of a title on their office door. It's a recognition of the character they show when no one is watching and when there is no reward other than the mission itself. Alex Morgan didn't save the ER for a medal. She did it because it was her job to protect her patients. So the next time you see someone working quietly in the corner, doing the boring work with absolute focus and a lack of ego. Take a second look. You might be looking at an anchor. You might be looking at a hero who has traded their weapon for a tool of healing, but kept the soul of a warrior perfectly intact. Don't judge the cover of the book. Value the character of the person inside, because when the world finally breaks and chaos comes through the door, it's not the loud ones who hold it together. It's the quiet professionals who refuse to let the formation break. They are the ones who see the shot, take the breath, and ensure that everyone gets home safe. Be that person. Be the calm in the storm. If you believe the quiet professionals who solve the hardest problems deserve recognition, leave a comment and subscribe to the Veteran Story. We tell the stories behind the calm minds that change everything.